Stand on North Street in Endicott, New York, on a January morning in 2025, and you will watch excavators eat a building that once contained the future. The white concrete facade is coming down in pieces. Above the laboratory door, barely visible before the machinery reaches it, a single word is inscribed in the frieze with the gravity of a classical dedication. Think. Then the excavator swings, and it is gone. This is the birthplace of IBM. Someone has decided it is time to stop remembering. At their peak, these buildings employed 16,000 people in a village of 13,000. They produced the machines that organized the Social Security Administration, that tracked every soldier in the Second World War, that taught American corporations how to count and sort and tabulate on a scale never before attempted. They produced something else, too, something that only came to light in 2002, the same year the factories closed. Something that is still in the ground beneath Endicott's homes and churches and barbershops, and that will remain there long after the last wall comes down. This is not a story about a company that succeeded. It is a story about what success costs and who pays. Before we go further, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments and subscribe if you're new here. This one gets darker before it gets more complicated. Now, back to that street in upstate New York, and to the valley that made it. Endicott did not choose IBM. The valley chose it, the Susquehanna River Valley in New York's southern tier, that industrious corridor between the Catskills and the Pennsylvania border where the 19th century had built its factories close to water and its workers close to the factories. The valley had its own industrial logic long before computing existed. Rivers meant power. Power meant mills. Mills meant workers. Workers meant towns. And towns meant the particular kind of social contract that American industry wrote in the late 19th century, in which a company provided employment and a community provided labor, and the relationship between them was understood by both parties to be the whole of what either required. By 1900, that contract had found its most complete expression in Endicott in the person of George F. Johnson and the Endicott-Johnson Shoe Company. By 1950, the largest shoe manufacturer in the world, Johnson was a patriarch of the old industrial school, a man who believed that the relationship between employer and worker was fundamentally familial and whose factories reflected that belief in their architecture. Endicott-Johnson's buildings were red brick, honest, blunt, physically identical to the labor they housed. Johnson called his philosophy the square deal, and he delivered it without ornament. Decent wages, company benefits, the implicit understanding that if you worked for EJ, you were part of something larger than a single shift. Job-seeking immigrants arriving at Ellis Island were apocryphally directed to Endicott by word of mouth. Italians settled on the north side, forming what is still called Little Italy. Polish and Slovak families clustered in their own neighborhoods, each group bringing with it the particular European working-class culture that the valley's factories gradually absorbed and standardized. The community that resulted was organized around labor in the most literal sense, around the specific rhythms of shift changes and paydays, and the annual rhythms of the industrial calendar. Children grew up knowing which factory their parents worked in, the way children in other towns knew which church their families attended. It was into this landscape, already organized around the paternalist bargain, already accustomed to the idea of a company as a social world, that the machines arrived. In 1906, Harlow Bundy, a manufacturer of time recorders based in nearby Binghamton, moved his International Time Recording Company into a new 3-story brick building in Endicott. The building sat at the intersection of North Street and McKinley Avenue, modest enough that no contemporary account thought to describe it in detail. A factory building, functional, unadorned, distinguished from nothing around it. By 1907, all ITR operations had transferred to this address, the machines being made there. Time clocks that recorded workers' arrival and departure on a paper tape were themselves a kind of argument about labor and accountability, about the measurability of human time, that neither the workers who punched them nor the managers who read them had yet fully understood. Endicott in 1906 was a village of roughly 4,000 people, close enough to Binghamton to share its economic orbit, and far enough away to maintain its own identity as a working-class community built around EJ's shoe factories. North Street was its commercial spine. The arrival of the ITR building was not, at the time, an event that any resident would have marked as significant. A small manufacturer relocating from the next town over, another set of machines, another employer competing with EJ for the same labor pool. What no one understood, what could not have been understood from the outside, was that the particular kind of machine being made at North Street and McKinley was about to grow into something that would eventually employ 4 times as many people in this village as EJ ever had. And then leave. On June 16, 1911, a financier named Charles Ranlett Flint formalized the logic that the machines had been pointing towards for years. Flint was an assembler of companies, a man who saw commercial value in convergence, who looked at manufacturers of computing scales, time recorders, and punch card tabulating machines and saw not 3 separate industries, but a single industry that had not yet recognized itself. He merged them into a holding company called the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, incorporated in New York State, headquartered in Endicott. The CTR's 5 constituent companies had 1,300 employees and offices in Binghamton, Dayton, Detroit, Washington, and Toronto. Flint was neither a technologist nor a visionary. He was a consolidator. What the company he assembled needed, and did not yet have, was someone who understood what it was supposed to become. What it did not yet have was Thomas J. Watson. Thomas John Watson was born on February 17, 1874, in Campbell, New York. In the southern tier, not far from where he would eventually build his empire, a geographical irony that the commemorative accounts tend to suppress in favor of the self-made man narrative that requires the hero to travel further. He was the 5th child and only son of Thomas and Jane Fulton White Watson, a family of Scottish descent that had immigrated from Ireland during the potato famine. His father was a lumber dealer near Painted Post. Watson grew up among the commercial transactions of a small rural business, absorbing by proximity what he would later systematize into a philosophy that selling was the highest form of human interaction, that the ability to persuade was the closest thing to a natural aristocracy that a democratic society permitted. He tried teaching first, quit on his first day. His father required him to attend business school, which he did, finishing accounting and commercial courses at the Elmira School of Commerce, and then taking a bookkeeping job at Clarence Risley's Market for $6 a week. The sedentary work lasted less than a year. He went on the road selling sewing machines and pianos, studying veteran salesmen while he held their horses, learning the craft of persuasion from the outside in before he had been given the chance to practice it himself. His career changed permanently when he joined the National Cash Register Company in Buffalo in 1895, working under the mentorship of the company's star salesman, John Range. NCR was the dominant force in its market, and its president, John Henry Patterson, was among the most ruthless and innovative corporate leaders of his generation. Watson rose quickly, from branch manager to general sales manager, absorbing Patterson's methods with the attention of a man who knew his own ambition exceeded his current position. Patterson's company operated with the energy of a religious movement. Sales conventions resembled revival meetings. Slogans adorned every wall. The culture was evangelical, hierarchical, and effective, and Watson took all of it with him when he eventually left. He did not leave voluntarily. In 1912, Watson and Patterson, along with 28 other NCR executives, were convicted of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The specific charge against Watson involved the creation of a fake second-hand cash register company designed to undercut competitors' prices and destroy the used machine market. Watson was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $5,000 fine. The conviction was later overturned on appeal on an evidentiary technicality, and Watson escaped incarceration. He did not escape the professional consequences. Patterson fired him. The widely publicized trial had attached his name to the phrase unfair business practices in newspapers across the country, and the employment market reacted accordingly. This is the founding fact of IBM, though you will not find it described as such in IBM's official histories. Watson did not build the company from strength. He built it from humiliation. Charles Flint hired him in 1914 as general manager of CTR specifically because Flint needed someone desperate enough to work for a floundering holding company with an awkward name and a fragmented culture. And Watson, a convicted man with a fired man's hunger and a salesman's precision about what the world owed him, was exactly that. He was made president 11 months later, once his antitrust matters were resolved. He would hold the position in one form or another for 42 years. He married Jeanette Kittredge on April 17, 1913, the daughter of a prominent Dayton railroad family. It was a socially upward match, and Watson understood it as such. The couple would have 4 children: Thomas Jr., born in 1914, Jeanette, Helen, and Arthur. Watson took his family's advancement as seriously as he took the company's, and he was not always careful to distinguish between the two. The famous Think slogan originated before IBM, which is itself a fact of some significance. At an NCR sales meeting in Dayton, Ohio, in December 1911. The sources conflict on the precise year, but the account is consistent. Watson was frustrated with colleagues who were producing no useful ideas. He walked to the front of the room and delivered what observers described as a 10-minute lecture that began as a scolding and ended as a philosophy. The trouble with every one of us, he said, is that we don't think enough. We don't get paid for working with our feet. We get paid for working with our heads. He wrote "think" on the chalkboard in block letters. Asked later what he meant by the slogan, Watson said, "By think, I mean take everything into consideration." I refuse to make the sign more specific. If a man just sees "think," he'll find out what I mean. He carried the word to CTR in 1914 and made it the company's soul. It would travel further than any machine IBM ever built. Watson's first act of identity construction at Endicott was architectural, where the Endicott Johnson factories across North Street were red brick, honest, blunt, working class in their very materials. Watson's buildings would be white, luminous. Painted concrete and glass block, catching light rather than absorbing it, announcing that whatever happened inside these walls was not grimy factory work, but something cleaner, more cerebral, and more worthy of being seen. This was not aesthetic preference. It was a declaration, as deliberately composed as anything Watson ever put in a sales memo. The contrast with E.J.'s vernacular factories was not accidental. Watson was making an argument about the nature of the work his company did, that it was industrial, but not merely physical, that the people inside his buildings thought for a living rather than simply laboring, and that the buildings should communicate this distinction to anyone who walked past them on North Street. He was, in this sense, anticipating something that later corporate architects would make explicit: that a building is a species of brand communication, and that the gap between what a company says about itself and what its physical environment implies is a gap that customers and employees notice, even when they cannot articulate it. The factories expanded rapidly under Watson's supervision to encompass 65,000 square feet of orderly geometric buildings. Their ornament was specific and deliberate, string courses and cornices marking the vertical rhythms of the stories, and above each entrance, stamped into the concrete decorative panels depicting the ancient precursors of IBM's technology: hourglasses, scales, abashi, the machines that had preceded IBM's machines, the tools with which human beings had first attempted to measure and organize the world. Watson was connecting his present enterprise to the longest possible history of human calculation, claiming for punch-card tabulators the lineage of civilization's oldest cognitive instruments. In 1933, he moved the company's research division to Endicott from New York City and built a new laboratory building that formalized everything the factories had been suggesting. The building was Federal Revival in style: red brick, entered through a portico of Neo-Egyptian columns, topped with a cupola, fully air-conditioned at a time when air conditioning was still a novelty significant enough to be mentioned in press accounts. Inside, elaborate wood paneling and marble. Outside, in the frieze above the entrance, inscribed with the gravity that older buildings reserved for founding dates or dedicatory phrases: think. The most important feature was not the temperature or the marble. It was the word. Watson had put his slogan in stone, given it the physical permanence of architecture, made it a dedication in the classical sense. The announcement of a purpose to which this structure and the work conducted within it were formally committed. You did not post think on a chalkboard here. You carved it above the door through which thinkers entered. Around the laboratory, the campus continued to accumulate. A schoolhouse where employees studied the latest engineering developments, a swimming pool, a company cafeteria, and beginning in 1931, the IBM Country Club, built around the Crocker homestead, a tavern and inn constructed beginning in 1799 by Ezekiel Crocker and his son Oliver, making it one of the oldest structures in Broome County. IBM purchased it, expanded it, and transformed it into something that functions in retrospect as the most complete expression of Watson's paternalist ambition. The country club's facilities cataloged the pleasures IBM believed its workers deserved: a golf course, outdoor swimming pools, bowling alleys, a shooting range, billiard hall, ballroom and dance floor, softball and tennis courts lit for use on summer evenings. Membership cost every employee, or from the factory floor to the boardroom, $1 per year. A complete dinner of Southern fried chicken, cranberry sauce, green beans, mashed potatoes, rolls, and choice of dessert cost 35 cents. No alcohol was served at any IBM event. Ever. Watson's sobriety mandate was moral architecture as surely as the think inscription was intellectual architecture. Both encoded his values into the physical environment of the company. The homestead portion of the complex functioned simultaneously as a hotel for visiting executive customers and as a classroom for the sales training that Watson considered the company's most essential ongoing activity. Once a year, a temporary tent city sprang up on the grounds to house the overflow when IBM's 100% Club, every salesman who had reached or exceeded 100% of their annual quota, gathered at Endicott for what was part sales conference, part revival meeting, and entirely Watson's production. He presided. He always presided. The paternalist architecture extended beyond the physical campus. Watson declared in the 1920s that IBM would not lay off employees during economic downturns, a promise radical enough in the context of the Depression that it became central to the company's identity. When the Depression arrived and other manufacturers in the valley reduced their workforces, IBM kept its people employed. Stockpiling machines that no one was yet buying in warehouses that Watson had specifically built to hold the inventory. He was gambling that the demand would return. He was right, and when the Social Security contract arrived in 1935, and IBM suddenly needed to produce punch cards at a volume no one had previously imagined, those warehoused machines and retained workers became the infrastructure that made fulfillment possible. Watson's gamble had not merely been humane. It had been strategically correct in ways that only became visible in retrospect. In return for security, Watson expected total identification. Employees wore IBM's colors. They sang IBM songs, actual songs, printed in company songbooks, with lyrics that praised the company's products, its leaders, and the philosophy of service. The songs were sung at conventions with the earnestness that another organization might have reserved for hymns, because the distinction between the two was one that Watson's culture did not clearly draw. The men and women of Endicott who spent their careers inside Watson's white buildings were, in many cases, genuinely grateful. The country club, the guaranteed employment, the sense of belonging to something whose importance was self-evident and whose benevolence was demonstrated in concrete terms. These were real benefits, and the people who received them knew the difference between having them and not having them. That the culture which produced these benefits was simultaneously capable of other things the recipients did not know about and would not have sanctioned, is the central difficulty of IBM's history, and it begins here. By the late 1930s, Watson had built not merely a factory complex, but an argument that the people who worked there were thinkers rather than laborers, that their employer was a civilization rather than merely a manufacturer. The word think endured in stone above the laboratory door, watching over a campus that had no idea what it was about to be asked to do. The machines built in Endicott's white factories did not stay in Endicott. They went everywhere. To the offices of corporations and governments across 6 continents, to the counting rooms of insurance companies and the payroll departments of railroads, to agencies of the federal government, that had discovered IBM's punch cards could organize almost anything human beings needed to organize, provided there were enough holes and enough cards. By the 1930s, IBM controlled approximately 90% of the world market in punch card technology. Not because competitors lacked the capacity to build comparable machines, but because of the specific commercial mechanism Watson had inherited from CTR and perfected into a near-total instrument of market dominance. IBM did not sell its machines. It leased them. The distinction was not merely financial. By retaining ownership of every machine in the field, IBM also retained exclusive authority over the punch cards those machines required, and the technicians authorized to service them. Every customer was a permanent dependent. The revenue was recurring, predictable, and compounding. The control was structural rather than contractual, which meant it survived the individual transaction and persisted for as long as the machine remained in service. Watson had taken a simple leasing model and made it the architecture of an empire. The Supreme Court ordered IBM in 1936 to stop requiring customers to purchase exclusively IBM punch cards. The ruling made little practical difference. IBM controlled the market so completely that no alternative supply chain had developed to make the order meaningful. Profits continued. The machines continued, the empire continued. The single contract that confirmed IBM's transformation from private company to national infrastructure arrived in 1935. The Social Security Act had just created the largest record-keeping obligation in American history. The federal government now needed to assign, track, and maintain earnings records for 26 million workers across every industry in every state in the country. The Social Security Board opened a competition for the contract to manage this task. IBM won it. The Endicott factories produced the punch cards, 26 million individual accounts, each represented by a card, each card requiring periodic updating as wages were reported, each update requiring sorting and cross-tabulation on a scale that no previous administrative system had attempted. The operation required an additional 300 million punch cards per year just to keep the records current. Watson's leasing model ensured that every card fed back into IBM's revenue stream. The federal government had not merely become an IBM customer. It had become structurally dependent on IBM's technology for one of its foundational social commitments. Watson's ambitions were not confined to commerce. He was, by the 1930s, engaged in the simultaneous construction of a civic identity that he had determined should accompany and dignify the commercial one. He served as trustee of Columbia University beginning in 1933, a position he held until his death. He engineered the appointment of Dwight D. Eisenhower as Columbia's president, a piece of institutional maneuvering that demonstrated his understanding of how civic influence was accumulated in the American system, which was not through hereditary position, but through the patient cultivation of relationships with men whose authority exceeded one's own. He served as president of the International Chamber of Commerce in 1937. He collected honorary degrees from universities across 3 continents and received decorations from the governments of a dozen nations. The convicted man from Campbell, New York, had become, in the eyes of the institutions that distribute such recognitions, a statesman of commerce, a figure whose stature transcended the company he ran and attached itself to the idea of American enterprise at its most self-confident. The Think slogan traveled as far as the machines. By 1948, IBM was distributing 9,000 Think signs annually to offices, factories, and customers worldwide. By 1960, that number had climbed to 20,000. The signs appeared on desks and walls in corporate offices in Buenos Aires, in Shanghai, in Lagos. IBM employees carried pocket-sized notebooks with Think embossed on the cover. The company published an employee magazine called Think. The motto appeared on stationery, matchbooks, and scratch pads throughout every IBM facility in the world. What Watson had scrawled on a chalkboard during a frustrating sales meeting had become the most widely quoted corporate motto in history, the one-word distillation of a management philosophy that other companies studied, and that Watson's son Thomas Jr. would later describe as the seed from which IBM's entire culture had grown. Watson's net worth at death was estimated at approximately $2 million, a figure that startles in context. He had built an institution that employed 60,000 people and had offices in more than 130 countries. And he had done it by drawing a salary rather than accumulating equity in the sense that later technology executives would make normative. He was one of the richest men of his time. Contemporaries said, but the figure was modest relative to the scale of what he had built, which suggests something important about the relationship between Watson and IBM. He did not own it the way founders own companies today. He inhabited it. The company was his identity more than his asset, which is perhaps why he held on to the chairmanship until he was 82 years old, allowing his son to become president in 1952 while retaining ultimate authority himself. Tom Jr. would describe the dynamic with characteristic precision. He wanted to make me head of IBM, but he didn't like sharing the limelight. Watson died on June 19, 1956, in New York City, only weeks after formally transferring the chief executive role to his son. He had been the company's animating force for 42 years. His wife, Jeanette, established the Thomas J. Watson Foundation in his honor in 1961. Everything IBM had become traced back to the convicted man who had arrived in Endicott in 1914 with a chalkboard slogan and a determination to prove that his first career was not his final verdict. Before his death, the Endicott factories had produced something else, something Watson did not put in the commemorative speeches, and that the company did not include in the official accounts of its wartime contributions. But before we reach that chapter, the war itself demands its accounting. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, IBM converted its manufacturing operations to war production with the speed of a company accustomed to executing Watson's instructions without delay. The Endicott facilities produced the Browning automatic rifle, the M1 carbine, and components for the Norden bomb sight, the precision bombing instrument that the Army Air Forces used to navigate the bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific. 57 IBM employees from Endicott were killed in combat during the war. Their names were placed on a memorial that Watson ensured received permanent prominence in company communications. He was not a man who failed to understand the symbolic value of sacrifice. The factory floor in Endicott during the war years operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, weapons production, war contracts, the transformation of a computing instrument manufacturer into a defense supplier almost overnight. On the other, the continuing manufacture and maintenance of the punch card machines and tabulators that the federal government's wartime bureaucracy required to function. The Army, the Navy, the War Department, the Treasury, the War Production Board, all of them ran on IBM equipment, all of it leased, all of it serviced by IBM technicians, whose expertise made them as essential to the war's administrative machinery as any weapon being assembled on the same factory floor. The most consequential IBM contribution to the Allied war effort was not a weapon. It was a card. IBM produced a punch card for every soldier in the United States military. Tracking assignments, medical records, training history, equipment issuance, and discharge status across 12 million service members. The cards were processed on IBM machines leased to the War Department at rates Watson personally negotiated with the Secretary of War. The administrative machinery of the largest mobilization in American history ran on Endicott's product. When the war ended and the veterans came home, IBM cards followed them into the Veterans Administration, tracking benefits, pensions, and medical claims for the rest of their lives. Watson, who had preached that IBM was in the service of humanity, had found in the war the most literal possible demonstration of the claim. The machines organized the men. They did it on both sides. And at the center of all of it, micromanaging every dollar from his Madison Avenue office, while the white buildings on North Street hummed with production, was that same man running another empire entirely, one that no one in Endicott was supposed to know about, and that took 60 years to fully document. Beginning in January 1933, in the first days of Adolf Hitler's government, Watson made a business decision. Nazi Germany was already IBM's most profitable foreign operation, built on the foundation of De Homag, the Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, IBM's German subsidiary. acquired outright in 1923. By the time Hitler came to power, Watson had transformed the formerly struggling De Homag into a flagship, producing more than 3 times above its quota, staffed by IBM trained technicians, supplied exclusively by IBM's punch cards, and spare parts. The opportunity Hitler's government represented, from the perspective of a man who thought in market terms, was not difficult to calculate. Nazi Germany offered the prospect of government control, supervision, surveillance, and regimentation on a scale never previously attempted. The fact that Hitler intended to extend his Reich to other nations only expanded the prospective customer base. IBM's punch cards were custom designed to Nazi specifications. Hole 3 signified homosexual, Hole 8 designated a Jew. The cards could be sorted and cross-tabulated at 25,000 cards per hour, producing statistical portraits of a population with a speed and precision that no previous technology had approached. In 1933, IBM hired thousands of people to execute a door-to-door racial census of Germany. The first step in the systematic identification of Jewish residents that Hitler required before any further action was possible. Once the census data existed, IBM created systems to cross-tabulate it against professional and employment databases and financial records, enabling the German government to locate, identify, and systematically impoverish Jewish households with bureaucratic efficiency. Location data then organized the transfer of Jews from their homes into ghettos. From the ghettos, they were loaded onto trains. Those trains ran on IBM punch card scheduling programs that compressed a 2-week car routing process into 48 hours, keeping the deportation timetables precise. IBM customer sites, designated Abteilung Hollerith, operated in virtually every concentration camp. The labor assignments, prisoner counts, and death records of the camps were fed into IBM machines at a central processing facility at Oranienburg. The machinery of extermination was, in the most literal administrative sense, organized by IBM's technology. Watson personally micromanaged the De Homag relationship from New York. He preferred verbal instructions to written contracts, a structure that provided deniability while preserving control, a refinement of the technique that had gotten him convicted at NCR adapted to a different scale of consequence. His German managers signed their reports awaiting your further instructions and meant it. When De Homag managers once wanted to paint a corridor, they waited for Watson's specific permission. His auditors tracked the disposition of every Reichsmark. Not infrequently, the German managers complained about his domination. In June 1937, Watson traveled to Berlin to meet Adolf Hitler as president of the International Chamber of Commerce. Hitler awarded him the Merit Cross of the German Eagle with Star, Germany's second highest civilian honor for foreign nationals. Created specifically to recognize those who had made themselves deserving of the German Reich. Watson accepted it. He wore it. For 3 years he wore it, while the newspapers reported what the Reich was doing with the tools his company had supplied. It was not until 1940, when American public opinion had hardened irrevocably against Germany, that Watson returned the medal under public pressure. When he did, outraged German IBM executives and high-ranking Nazi officials threatened to seize control of De Homag away from IBM's New York headquarters. Watson's commercial relationship with the Reich had become so structurally essential to the regime that withdrawing from it carried genuine risk. Throughout the war, IBM continued to collect profits from De Homag through a network of financial arrangements that bypassed direct American-German transactions. The revenues accumulated in blocked accounts and were remitted through neutral countries after the war ended. IBM, in other words, did not merely provide the technology that organized the Holocaust, it collected payment for doing so. Watson's son, Thomas Jr., who eventually succeeded him and transformed IBM into the computer giant of the 1960s and 70s, spent years in his memoir and in private conversations grappling with this inheritance. He could not resolve it. He had been a young man during the Nazi period, working in his father's company, not yet in a position to act as a counterforce against the man whose shadow he spent his entire professional life trying to escape. The moral weight passed down the family line along with the chairmanship. In 2001, investigative journalist Edwin Black published IBM and the Holocaust, a meticulously documented account of the strategic relationship between Watson's company and the Nazi government. built from archives in the United States, Britain, Germany, France, and Israel. The book became a New York Times bestseller and has sold more than 1 million copies. It documented with archival precision what Watson had micromanaged from New York: the census, the cross-tabulation, the deportation logistics, the concentration camp processing, the entire administrative architecture of the final solution, organized by IBM's leased equipment and IBM's custom-designed cards and IBM's on-site technicians. IBM has never directly denied Black's documented evidence. The company claimed most wartime records had been destroyed. A lawsuit filed under the Alien Tort Claims Act in 2001 was dropped, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because lawyers feared the litigation would delay payments from a German Holocaust survivor fund. IBM's German division contributed $3 million to that fund without admitting liability. The workers who assembled IBM machines in Endicott's white factories, who ate their 35-cent dinners at the country club, who sent their children to the pool in the summer, who heard Watson preach about thinking and excellence at the annual 100% club conventions, did not know that some of the machines their hands had made were being serviced by IBM technicians inside the wire at Dachau. The word "think" inscribed above their laboratory door was not asking the question it should have been. The war ended. The machines kept running. Through the 1950s and 1960s and into the 70s, IBM's factories in Endicott used industrial solvents to clean the circuit boards and components that were replacing the punch card machines as the company's primary product. Trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, volatile organic compounds that dissolved grease and manufacturing residue with industrial efficiency. And that, when poured down drains or left to leak from underground tanks and 5 miles of aging pipes, dissolved into the Susquehanna River aquifer with equal efficiency. This was not a dramatic accident. It was a pattern, diffuse, accumulating, unreported. 6 documented spills and leaks. The largest, in 1979, was 4,100 gallons of TCA from a single underground storage tank. 5 miles of underground piping leaked at various points over various years. Delivery drivers spilled solvents. Workers poured waste into drains that were not connected to pipes. The contents of unsealed wells and what IBM's own documents described as a sludge landfill seeped continuously into the earth beneath the campus. The chemicals IBM had used to make machines clean were making the ground beneath Endicott permanently unclean in ways that the technology of the time could neither fully detect nor remediate. The contaminated groundwater plume that resulted covers 350 acres south of the plant. TCE and PCE migrated through the aquifer and then upward, moving through the soil and into the air inside structures built above the plume. Homes, churches, billiard bars, barbershops, entering through cracks in foundations and filling indoor air with carcinogenic vapor at concentrations that regulators would eventually classify as a significant threat to public health. The community of Endicott did not learn their village was contaminated until 2002. The same year IBM closed its factories, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation reclassified the site as a Class II hazardous waste facility, the designation reserved for sites where contamination constitutes a genuine threat rather than a theoretical one. IBM entered into a formal consent order in 2004 requiring investigation and remediation across 7 operable units. Run continuously, powered by 90-watt run continuously, powered by 90-watt motors, and the sound they make, a low, persistent drone, ignorable as ambient noise, and then suddenly heard again, became the acoustic signature of life in the plume. IBM's most persistent physical presence in Endicott was no longer the white factory buildings or the Think inscription. It was a hum in the basement. By 2004, IBM had pumped more than 800,000 gallons of contaminated groundwater from the site, so much that sinkholes began forming in the soil as the water table dropped. The chemicals bound themselves to the dirt and the bedrock. Environmental engineers told the DEC it might take technology that had not yet been developed to fully eliminate the VOCs from the groundwater. more than 20 years into the remediation effort, the plume remains. Health studies conducted in the affected area found elevated rates of testicular cancer among males and kidney cancer across both genders. Research on workers from the Endicott plant found elevated rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, rectal cancer, and certain neurological diseases. Studies of women occupationally exposed to TCE found a threefold elevated risk of spontaneous abortion. Exposure to PCE carried a nearly fivefold risk. Epidemiologists were careful in their language. The causation studies were inconclusive, they said, the methodology complex, the data difficult to interpret. Community advocacy groups formed to dispute that caution. RAGE, the Residential Advocacy Group of Endicott. CARE, Citizens Acting to Restore Endicott's Environment. The Western Broome Environmental Stakeholders Coalition, whose members spent years attending public hearings and pushing state agencies to act with the urgency the situation warranted. They pushed. The pace of the cleanup remained slow. The DEC noted IBM's cleanup efforts critically in its 2004 consent order. Congress members called the situation dangerous. The state's own health guidelines for TCE allowed concentrations nearly 300 times higher than California's proposed standard. The people attending those public hearings were not abstractions. They were the children and grandchildren of the workers who had eaten 35-cent dinners in IBM's country club. They were people who had grown up understanding that IBM's presence in Endicott was a form of security, economic, social, communal, and who were now sitting in folding chairs in municipal meeting rooms, being told by environmental consultants that the security had been conditional in ways no one had disclosed. Former workers described the work practices of the 1950s and 60s with the specificity of people who had spent decades not knowing that the specifics mattered. The drums left uncovered, the drains that ran nowhere, the smell of solvents that everyone in the factory was told was normal and harmless, and that older workers still associated decades later with the smell of a good job. IBM had left Endicott two things: a century of identity and a plume of carcinogens moving slowly through the bedrock beneath their homes. The identity was fading. The plume was not. While all of this was happening underground, while the solvents were moving through the aquifer and the sinkholes were forming and the motors were beginning their long hum, something else was happening in boardrooms in Armonk, New York, where IBM had moved its corporate headquarters after the war. By the mid-1980s, IBM was reinventing itself as a company that managed information rather than manufactured the instruments of its management. The shift had been underway for years, driven by the personal computer revolution that IBM had both catalyzed and failed to fully capitalize on, and by the emergence of software and services as the industry's primary value-generating activities. Making things was becoming less profitable than telling other people how to manage the things they made. The white buildings on North Street had not yet been told. Employment at the Endicott complex peaked at approximately 16,000 people in the mid-1980s, a figure that itself contains the story of everything that followed. Because peaks are only visible in retrospect. On September 12, 1984, President Ronald Reagan toured the IBM Endicott complex and shook hands with the company's local leadership while cameras recorded the visit for the evening news. The head of IBM's Endicott operations announced plans for 3 new buildings and spoke of growth with the confidence of a man who could not yet see what the next 18 years would dismantle. Reagan nodded. The cameras captured it. It was the last good moment, and it simply did not know it was the last good moment yet. The withdrawals began quietly, as institutional withdrawals always do. Not as a single announced departure, but as a sequence of smaller decisions. Each defensible in isolation, each contributing to a cumulative outcome that no individual decision-maker had formally authorized. Research moved, administrative functions relocated. The center of gravity migrated steadily northward and westward toward Armonk and eventually toward the distributed global architecture that IBM's transformation into a services company required. Employment fell from 16,000 to thousands fewer over the course of the 1990s. Each reduction described in corporate communications as a strategic realignment rather than an abandonment. The numbers tracked downward with the efficiency of a ledger being settled. By the early 1990s, the Endicott complex employed roughly 6,000 people, less than half the peak. By the late 90s, that number had fallen again. By 2002, when the manufacturing site was sold, the workforce that remained was a fraction of what it had been when Reagan shook hands and the cameras filmed. Broome County's overall unemployment rate climbed as IBM's headcount fell. The county that had organized its economic identity around the certainty of IBM's permanence found itself in the 1990s performing a kind of triage, seeking replacement industries, retraining displaced workers, applying for federal economic development grants, and doing all of this while simultaneously managing the contamination disclosure that arrived with exquisite timing, the moment the last manufacturing jobs were gone. Population in the broader southern tier region fell steadily through the 1990s and 2000s. Young people left for cities with different economies. The housing stock aged, the tax base contracted. What had been one of the most employment-stable small industrial cities in the Northeast became, by measures that economists use to describe such places, a legacy city. A place whose best economic days were in a past it could document but not recover. In 2002, IBM sold the Endicott manufacturing site to a group of Broome County businessmen and spun off its microelectronics division as a new entity called Endicott Interconnect Technologies. The company leased some space back temporarily, maintaining enough presence to forestall the word departure. But the word applied. By 2007, IBM had vacated the factory buildings entirely. The structures sat on what was now called the Huron campus. The IBM name removed, replaced with a designation that carried no weight of history and no obligation to the past. The decay that followed was comprehensive. The white concrete facades that Watson had built to announce the company's intellectual refinement began to peel. Windows were boarded. Graffiti appeared on the walls of the old country club, "Did You Ever Love Me?" in searing pink paint on an unbroken window, alongside less printable sentiments. The iconic International Business Machines logo remained legible on one crumbling facade until the elements and the vandals reduced it to suggestion. Urban explorers documented the interiors and posted what they found online. Collapsed ceilings, flooded basement rooms, the outdoor swimming pool's light blue interior fading, the bowling alley lane still vaguely visible beneath debris. The IBM Country Club had made a last attempt at survival in 1994, when the company renamed it the Heritage Country Club and Conference Center and opened it to public membership. Trying to generate revenue from a facility the company could no longer justify maintaining exclusively for employees who were rapidly ceasing to exist in sufficient numbers to use it. The attempt failed. By the late 90s, the club was closed. It remained vacant and accessible to anyone willing to ignore the trespassing signs for more than 2 decades. Accumulating vandalism and structural deterioration, and the particular atmosphere of places that have been left too long without purpose. In October 2023, IBM closed its last offices in Endicott. The company had been present in the village for 112 years. It left the way institutions leave, not in a single moment of acknowledged departure, but through the accumulated paperwork of 100 small withdrawals. Until one day there was simply nothing left to withdraw from. Watson Boulevard still bore his name. The buildings remained. They would not remain much longer. The Country Club went first. In late 2022, the agency, Broome County's industrial development arm, announced that the IBM Country Club complex on Watson Boulevard, condemned by an engineering firm as unsafe for firefighting operations, would be demolished. The Crocker Homestead, built in 1799, one of the oldest structures in Broome County, would come down with it. The agency had purchased the property in 2021 and determined that decades of vandalism and neglect had carried the building past the threshold of salvageability. The cost of preservation had become prohibitive. The cost of demolition would be covered by $2 million from Broome County and a matching contribution from the town of Union. Before the excavators arrived, the agency and LaChase Construction organized a Get a Brick Day on November 17, 2022, inviting community members to come to the site and take a brick from the Crocker homestead. People came, former IBM employees, children of former employees, people who remembered the 35-cent dinners and the summer evenings at the lit tennis courts and the 100% club conventions when tent cities spread across the grounds, and the whole valley understood that IBM was permanent, that its country club was permanent, that the bargain the company had struck with Endicott would endure because powerful things endure. They took their bricks and went home with a piece of a wall that had witnessed 123 years of the valley's history and would witness nothing further. During demolition of the Crocker homestead, workers discovered a time capsule inside the building's cornerstone. It was labeled 1951, sealed during the full flush of IBM's dominance, when the factories were producing at capacity, when every soldier's file contained an IBM card, when the Think slogan was plastered on 20,000 walls worldwide, when Watson was 77 years old and still chairman. The capsule's contents were set aside for a groundbreaking ceremony that would accompany the construction of the 75-unit affordable housing complex planned for the site. Inside, photographs, a newspaper, a directory of IBM Endicott employees, and a list of then-current IBM products. Sure, a snapshot of a company at its zenith, sealed by people who had no reason to imagine the building holding it would ever come down. The domestic structure that IBM had absorbed into its paternalist empire and then abandoned was being replaced by housing for people who could not afford the region's market rate. The site of the 100% Club's annual revival meeting would become affordable apartments. One building from the complex survived. The traditions at the Glen Hotel and Spa, the old homestead, the hotel and classroom and executive retreat, operates today as a functioning hospitality business. The intimate structure preserved, the monument demolished. It is the same reversal that appears throughout the history of ambitious industrial building. The private, domestic structure outlasts the public declaration every time. On January 2nd, 2025, Broome County began what it formally designated the largest demolition project in its history. The removal of approximately 550,000 square feet of condemned factory buildings on the former IBM campus on North Street. The buildings had been vacant since 2007. Gorick Construction of Binghamton was the contractor. $6 million from New York State's Restore New York grant program and $2 million from Broome County's Federal American Rescue. Plan funds, $8 million in public money, paid for the demolition of the birthplace of one of the world's wealthiest corporations. The New York State Historic Preservation Office required, as a condition of its approval, that every building scheduled for demolition be photographed before the work began. The photographs were uploaded to a website, documentation in place of preservation. The archive substituted for the building. It is a common enough institutional response to the problem of what cannot be saved, to record the thing rather than protect it, to produce the image rather than maintain the object, and to treat the image as an adequate substitute for the physical reality that produced it. Whether it is adequate is a question the people of Endicott are better positioned to answer than the people who made the decision. One structure was spared. The Clock Tower building, which contains the former office of Thomas J. Watson Sr., will remain intact as the historical anchor of what developers are calling the Phoenix campus. It stands now on cleared ground where 550,000 square feet of Watson's industrial vision once stood, the single surviving fragment of the built environment he created, preserved because it contains the room where he sat. The monument was demolished. The office endured. There is a lesson in this proportion, though it is not obvious what that lesson is. Simultaneously, as the excavators worked, the village of Endicott filed a lawsuit against IBM contending that the company's operations over the course of decades had contaminated the wells that supplied the village water system. IBM announced it would contest the claim. The legal argument about who owes what to whom for what was done to Endicott's ground will proceed through courts that will take years to reach a verdict. In the meantime, the 90-watt motors in the basements of Endicott's homes continue to run. What remains of IBM in Endicott can be cataloged in an afternoon, though the accounting takes longer than the afternoon suggests. The Clock Tower building stands on the Phoenix campus, a single preserved relic awaiting developers whose plans have not yet materialized into steel and glass. The IBM Museum at the Endicott Heritage Center is open Saturdays from 10 to 2. Its displays conceived and funded by IBM itself in 1984, the year Reagan visited, the year the retreat was already invisibly underway. The exhibits present the company's history with the confidence of an institution that expects to be admired. The early tabulating machines, the corporate milestones, the photographs of Watson presiding over his empire. What the museum does not address, what it was not designed to address. Having been built 38 years before the contamination became public knowledge, is the 350-acre plume beneath the streets outside its doors. The Traditions at the Glen Hotel still receives guests in the old homestead, the most intimate structure of the entire complex, having outlasted every monument that surrounded it. And in Washington, D.C., at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, there are Hollerith punchcard machines on permanent display. The tabulating technology that was IBM's primary product, the machines built in the white factories on North Street, the instruments used by the Nazi government to conduct the racial census of 1933 and to schedule the trains that ran to Auschwitz and Treblinka. They stand in the museum as evidence of what information technology can be made to do when it is operated by people who have decided that certain categories of human being do not require the protections that other human beings take for granted. The machines are in perfect condition. IBM maintained them well. The Watson AI system, named in Watson Sr.'s honor, launched publicly when it won the game show Jeopardy! In 2011, is today one of IBM's primary commercial products. A machine named for the man whose machines organized the Holocaust now processes natural language queries for enterprise clients and helps corporations make decisions. IBM markets it as cognitive computing, a term Watson Sr. would have recognized as the direct descendant of his own conviction that what machines offered was not merely calculation, but intelligence in service of human problems. The Think motto that Watson scrawled on a chalkboard in 1911 and inscribed in stone above a laboratory door in Endicott in 1933 inspired Apple's 1997 Think Different campaign, a direct subversion that positioned Apple as the alternative to the corporate conformity IBM's slogan had come to represent. The student surpassed the teacher's motto by inverting it, and the inversion became more famous than the original. IBM today is headquartered in Armonk, New York. It does not make machines. It sells software and services and the management of other people's information technology infrastructure. It is still one of the world's largest technology companies. It has no presence in Endicott, New York, other than the ongoing remediation obligation and the lawsuit filed in January 2025. In living rooms and basements and churches across Endicott, 90-watt motors run continuously against the trichloroethylene that IBM put in the ground during the decades when the country club was full and the pool was open and the think signs were on the walls and Reagan was shaking hands in the factory and the word on the laboratory frieze was still visible in stone. The company has no offices here. It has no employees here. What it has are pipes, white boxes attached to rooftops, humming with the low patience of machines built to outlast the intentions that produce them. There is a particular kind of American story that ends with the thing built being replaced by the problem it left behind. Watson built a machine to help us think. He inscribed the instruction in stone above a door that no longer exists, in a building that no longer stands, in a factory complex that is being removed piece by piece from a town that cannot afford to keep remembering it without public subsidies from a state government. He also built a machine that helped organize the Holocaust and ran it as a personal business relationship for 12 years. He built a country club where workers ate 35-cent dinners and felt genuinely that the company cared about them. And he also poured solvents into the ground beneath their homes for 30 years without telling them. These things are not contradictions to be resolved. They are the same person, the same institution, the same set of white buildings on North Street expressing the same psychology from the same address. IBM was both things simultaneously, the way most powerful institutions are both things simultaneously, the genuine achievement and the genuine cost. The think above the door and the TCE below the floor, the machines in the Holocaust Museum and the machines in the Jeopardy studio, all of it traceable to a valley in upstate New York, where a convicted man arrived in 1914 with a chalkboard slogan and built the most consequential information technology company in history. The Think sign is gone from the frieze. The clock tower building stands alone on cleared ground. The time capsule from 1951 has been opened. Its photographs and directories and newspaper examined, its frozen moment of confidence documented and set aside. And somewhere in the architecture of every device you are using right now, in the logical structure of every database, in the organizational grammar of every punch card's descendant, there is a logic that traces its ancestry to those white buildings on a street in upstate New York, where a man once stood in front of a chalkboard and wrote one word and meant it as an instruction, and had no idea what it would be asked to organize. He told us to think. Endicott is still living with what he did when he did.